Okay, so Be'ezras Hashem, what we're going to be doing is we're continuing with our series of shirim on entering into the Sea of Wisdom. And what we're going to focus on tonight is a really special treat, and that is that for most of the years that the Beis Medrash put out the yearbooks of Yam HaChachma, which was basically a compilation of all of the shirim, the Daf Yomi shirim, the Halacha shirim, Al Pi Pnimius, the different sugyos and Pnimius HaChasidus VaKabbalah. So these books used to be put out every year by the Beis Medrash, thousands of pages typically. And I believe they started coming out in Kuntresim already in Samech Hey, Tavshin Samech Hey, and then in Tavshin Samech Ches, they started printing them in hardcover in a beautiful way. And then they printed them until Tavshin Ayin Hey. They took a break, then they printed them again in Tavshin Ayin Tes. And then, I mean, the fact that they're coming out with a Hakdama to Tavshin Pei Beis, it's not necessarily an assumption that they're going to put out a new Sefer, but it's something that the Rebbe is returning to doing, which is that each year in the Sefer Yam HaChachma, what the Rebbe would do is he would darshan that year, that incoming year, meaning last year was Tafshin Pei Aleph, this year's Tafshin Pei Beis. And for the first 20 or 30 pages or so, as an introduction to the Yam HaChachma, the Rebbe would be masbir based on Panemius de Panemius, meaning the secrets of the secrets. I used to think that this was actually the deepest, so to speak, part of the Rebbe's Torah, only because it's osek very much in the question of Geula and the relationship between Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David. Every year, the Rebbe also spends time darshaning a specific element of that year, the spiritual potency of that year. And the opportunity, so to speak, or the mitzvah, or the particular emphasis that we need to be able to uncover the Mashiach of that year. Now, it's very important that the Rebbe always begins with the public service announcement that to talk about Geula, to talk about redemption, and to talk about a specific time period and the fertile ground that is born in that time period for the potency of redemption, it doesn't mean, God forbid, that the tzaddikim are saying that this is the year or that this is the time that Mashiach is supposed to come. As we know already, very strong lashonos from Chazal, that those who calculate the end should have their spirits removed from them, and calculating the end is a dangerous concept. It's something that we've seen throw Klal Yisrael into trauma after trauma after trauma, when we begin convinced that Mashiach has to come this year, and then lo and behold, it doesn't happen. So it leads the Jewish people astray, and it does not do any good for anybody. The Ramban already, in his Pirish on a Sefer called Sefer HaGeula, spent a lot of time calculating the years in which the Geula would arrive. The Vilna Gaon did as follows: the Bnei Yissaschar, different tzaddikim, the Veledniker and the Sheres Yisrael, the Rebbe Rashab, different tzaddikim had different emphases placed on different years. And the common denominator is that it is not being offered as a promise. It is not being offered in any clarified or absolute way, but rather it's b'derech tefillah, that by contemplating the spiritual potency of a given year, it gives us the ability to know what to yearn towards. And as we know, what we've learned from the Rebbe as well is that each and every year does carry with itself its own geula. Each and every year does, in truth, carry its own spark of Mashiach. That if a person is focused enough or a person is mindful enough as to what the avodah of that year is, so then they experience the karva el nafshi gi'ala. They experience their own personal redemption. So bein kach bein kach, either way you slice it, speaking about the possibility of a specific year being fertile ground for the redemption to arrive doesn't mean that it is some sort of calculation with regards to the end of days, God forbid, but rather it is representative of an idea that is meant to awaken our spiritual potency and to focus on what needs to be accomplished this year. So Tufshin Pei Beis, the Rebbe goes through a very I don't think it's a complex calculation. It's complex for me because mathematics is just not my strong suit whatsoever. But what the Rebbe is talking about is the fact that there's a sefer called the Sefer Bris Menucha. Now, Bris Menucha was an early sefer. It came before the Zohar HaKadosh came. But the Bris Menucha, although we don't know who authored it, we don't know specifically who authored it. The Ramak has different shitos. He says that one of the opinions was that it was the neshama of a Tana, and the other opinion is that it was one of the Rishonim or the Gaonim from that time period, And Kuli Amalo Pligi, that this is a sefer that finds itself in the holy history of the transmission of the secrets of Torah. Typically, we understand that we don't really learn books written prior to the emergence of the Ramban and his base medrash of Kabbalah, from which we kind of first have an exposure to the Zohar. But the Arizal and Rav Chaim Vital already write in the beginning of Eitz Chaim that there are particular previous generations of Mikubalim, of Kabbalists, whose words we need to really focus on very carefully. And the Sefer Bris Menucha is one of them. Now, the Sefer Bris Menucha, one of the remarkable things about it, the Ramchal was also very much involved in this Sefer. The Gra was very much involved. The Baal Shem Tov spent a lot of time studying the Sefer Bris Menucha. Sefer Bris Menucha is a Sefer that's meant to represent the avodah of the Kohen Gadol as he enters into the Kodesh HaKadoshim on Yom HaKippurim, and what that means for the avodah of tzaddikim with different names and different ways of understanding the interconnections of the worlds. But the Rebbe and his Chavrusa and his Talmidim have spent a lot of time really learning the Sefer Bris Menucha in an incredibly deep way to reveal that it contains nearly everything we've been discussing about from the Rebbe's Torah, but as well as the system of the Arizal and the Ramak. So instead of looking at it as just some sort of prophetic, kind of ecstatic Kabbalistic text, the Rebbe shows Kedarcha B'Kodesh that it's really expressing a very clear and systematized notion of what it means to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, one of the things that comes out from the Sefer Bris Menucha is that there are 10 ways to read the four-letter name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Shem Havaya, that the Kohen Gadol was meant to be machavein on the avodah of Yom Kippurim, that the tzaddikim are machavein in their avodah in Yom Kippurim. Sometimes it even expresses itself in Shemona Esrei. And again, we have Perushim from the Talmidim of the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh. We have Perushim from the Talmidim of the Gra. Of Menachem Mendel of Shklov has a Perush on the Sefer. So this is a Sefer that unifies all Zramim, all streams of Jewish thought. On a certain level, it's the bris, it's the convenant, which is the notion of connectivity. It's the effort to connect opposites. And Menucha is calmness. And what the Rebbe points out that it kind of is a unity between these two elements of Avodas Hashem. On the one hand, effort to kind of ensure that the connectivity is there, and also the restfulness and the peacefulness that we experience once the connection is there. It's a bris and it's a space of menucha. It's related to bina and it's related to chachma, the left side and the right side, which obviously, as we know from the Rebbe, the two opposites of the left and the right, of bina and chachma, of severity and calmness, of effort and rest, are really two elements of the same or, which is the or of Kesser, which is the or of that remarkable and wondrous unity that contains opposites within itself. One of my favorite teachings, actually, and the Rebbe brings it down in his Perush on Bris Menucha, which was printed a long time ago, and now they're beginning to reprint it a little bit more, is that the question of authorship of the Sefer of Bris Menucha has always been a question. And the Rebbe brings down from the Sefer Avodas Yom Kippurim, which was written by one of the Talmidim of the Maggid of Mezrich, so one of the Chavraya Kadisha of the original Talmidim of the Baal Shem Tov. And he writes that the reason we don't know the author of this book is because whoever is reading and studying this book, their thoughts and their emotional response to this book places them in the position of the author. So on the one hand, we're all the author of the book. If we're reading the book and we're contemplating the book, we, on a certain level, join the process of the writing of that book. Very much a remarkable way of looking at Torah Sheba'al Peh, that once a sefer is written, the tzaddik leaves that sefer open to the interpretation of the Jewish people, kol zman that we're studying it lishma, and our thoughts and our interpretations become part and parcel of that living text. So it's an incredible notion that there is no author, it's an anonymous text, primarily because each and every one of us who choose to descend into the text become part and parcel of the authorship process. Amongst these 10 permutations or ways of expressing, not permutations, but vowelizations, the nekudos. This is very much a sefer about the pronunciation of the words through the nekudos that we know, that we learn about at a very young age, the proper pronunciation of the Hebrew words. That these 10 ways of looking at the Shem Havaya are really going to be 10 different vowelization processes. The 7th vowelization of the four-letter name of Hashem is going to be the four-letter name of Hashem, which starts with the Nakuda of Segol underneath the Yud. Now, a segol is two dots side by side with a singular dot underneath in the center of those two dots. So it's three dots, it's an inverted triangle. It's one dot on the left, one dot on the right, and one dot in the center beneath the two. So what the Rebbe points out is that the Bris Menucha, when talking about this Nukuda Hashvi'i, this second vowelization of the Shem Havaya, which is referred to as the Segol, which is again the two dots on top and one unifying dot on the bottom, this is referred to as the Nikud of Geula. This is referred to as the vowelization that is associated with redemption, with the unifying process of taking opposites together, revealing the deep unity that exists amongst all of them to reveal a whole that is greater than the sum total of its parts, very much like the design of the segel represents. Two dots which represent disunity and disharmony and confrontation and machlokes and frustration between two polar opposites, and then a unifying third that holds all of them together to reveal an underlying unity. And the Bris Menucha has remarkable Lashonos, which the Rebbe brings down in this Hakdama L'Sefer Yam HaChachma Tafshin Pei Beis, where it shows that this process of the unity between all of these disparate parts that is representative by the segol of two dots as separate and then one dot as unifying that separateness is going to be associated with Geula, with redemption, which is a similar process that when we're able to make room for difference, when we're able to bring shalom into a place of machlokas and to recognize that all that appears to be separate and distinct from each other is in truth deeply unified, that's a revelation of Geula. The Rebbe continues, and he says that in the Bris Menucha, what we find is that there's a lashon, one of the lashonos that we find by this nikud of Geula, is the notion that ulebasof yom va'ashmura achas hameor hagimel v'chulei achas behem v'kabsim v'hashivosam l'maliosam keberishona. So we're not going to go into the mathematical process, but suffice it to say that very much based on the writings of the Vilna Gaon, the Leshem Shbei V'Chaloima, the Kamarna Rebbe also makes a big asek out of this, but it's particularly a tradition that comes down from the Beis Medrash of the Vilna Gaon, which was a Beis Medrash very involved in matters of Geula. The Talmidim of the Gaon saw him as Mashiach ben Yosef. This is why the Vilna Gaon wanted to travel to Eretz Yisrael even prior to the Baal Shem Tov wanting to get to Eretz Yisrael. And this is why it was really the Talmidim of the Gra who were the first Yishuv in Eretz Yisrael, because the Avodah of Mashiach ben Yosef on a certain level is to rectify this worldliness and to prepare it for the light of Mashiach ben David, which comes from above. And the Sefer Kol Hatur, which is the voice of the turtle dove, which is a verse that's associated with Geula, was written by one of the Talmidim of the Vilna Gaon, which spends a lot of time talking about the association between the life of the Vilna Gaon, the Torah of the Vilna Gaon, and the Torah of Mashiach ben Yosef. But suffice it to say that we live in a historical process of Shis Alfei Shan Dehave Alma, 6 eons, 6 millennia, right? And as we enter into the 7th millennia, that's going to be the Zman of Shabbos, that's going to be the Zman of the Geula itself. So we're told that the 6th millennia are going to be years of struggle, years of mundanity, like the 6 days of the week. And then comes the 7th generation, comes the 7th eon, that 7th part of the process, which is Shabbos. That's going to be the bittul of the olam, the churva of the olam, the destruction of the old way of things working, and it's going to be an entrance into Geula. But we know that anything that stands to be revealed in the future, which is Geula, can also be tasted in the present moment as well, which means that even if Geula only arrives at the end of the 6th millennia, nevertheless, there has to be a time period within the 6th millennia itself where we can begin to taste the process of Geula. Very similar to what the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Schlusi Yogan Aleinu, wrote, that just as there is a mitzvah of tasting the food of Shabbos on Erev Shabbos, based on the pasuk, To'ameh Chaim Zachu, that those who taste of life will merit life, so too there's an inyan of revealing the kates, revealing Geula even prior to the end. And the tzaddikim spent a lot of time calculating this. And what we see in this year, and anybody who wants to discuss it afterwards, we can go through the practical calculations, but this year, Tafshin Pei Beis, is a particularly precise year with regards to what the tzaddikim refer to as the Gilui of the Or of Chesed Befum Da'ama. It's the revelation of Chesed that emerges into the world. It's a taste of the Or HaGanuz that was concealed at the beginning of creation, which gives us the opportunity to reveal to ourselves and to the world at large that Choykatov Lahetiv, that in truth all that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has ever wanted to do is bestow goodness upon his creations, which is a mindfulness of redemption. That's a redemptive mindset. And whether or not it happens this year or not doesn't make a difference, because we can tap into that revelation. But the Rebbe continues, and this is where the Nakuda of the Rebbe comes out, or at least what I feel for myself is the Nakuda of the Rebbe, which is what I'm going to try and share. We've spoken about before the fact that for the Rebbe, based on the teachings of Rabbi Nachman, the Seder, the process in which Panemius HaTorah has been revealed into history, is not simply a random process where one teacher says one thing or another tzaddik says another thing, but rather it is a predestined form, a chain of revelation, if you will, through which the entirety of Panemius HaTorah, the inner teachings of Torah, are going to be revealed. And what the Rebbe refers to this as, based on the writings of Rabbi Nachman, is the Chamisha Yechidei Hadoros, the 5 singular tzaddikim, or the 5 historic tzaddikim. Now, these tzaddikim, the fact that they're historic doesn't mean that they're better than other tzaddikim. It just means that they're of a different shape and kind. Like we described before, I think in a recent shir, every solar system has planets in it, and every planet has its own moon or its source of illumination, and the stars that orbit, and all of the different elements of each particular planet. So we can look at these 5 transgenerational historic tzaddikim through whom Panemius HaTorah has been revealed as their own particular solar systems, and all of the planets and the stars and the moons that exist within that solar system, each and every one of them are also tzaddikim, Yesodei Olam, Tzaddikei Emes, but they just don't represent a particular subset of revelation of Torah. The 5 tzaddikim that the Torah has been revealed through were Moshe Rabbeinu, Raya Mehemna. All of the tzaddikim are simply just a new way of revealing the light of Moshe Rabbeinu. Then there's Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. After Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was the Arizal, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria. After the Arizal was the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh. And after the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh, there was Rabbi Nachman. So those 5 stages of the revelation of Torah throughout history means that each of these stations along the way represent not only a new quantity of Torah, a new amount of Torah coming down, but rather a new quality of Torah. It was an entirely different way of revealing Torah. So we're getting to the point that the Rebbe is going to be making about this year. So the third tzaddik, the third one of the Yechidei Hadoros was the Arizal. We know that the Arizal was only zocha to teach his Talmidim for 2 years. He spent 2 years in Eretz Yisrael, in Sfat, teaching Rav Chaim Vital and the Chavraya Kadisha. And what he said to his Talmidim is that I'm not zoicha, you're not zoicha to have me stick around for another 3 years. Because in truth, if I could have stuck around for another 3 years until the year Tafshin Hey, then I would have been able to reveal all of Gemara and Halacha through the lens of Pnimius HaTorah, which would have brought Mashiach. And already there's a section in the Shara Kavanos where Rav Chaim Vital told his Chevra to daven for the Arizal, to daven that Mashiach ben Yosef doesn't die. But nevertheless, the Arizal passed away 2 years earlier than Tafshin Hey, in the year Tafshin Lamed Gimel, and we were not Zoicha to that full Gilui of the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh, of the Arizal HaKadosh. And Rav Koenig points out that this is what it means, that Loisira beso mishalig, the pasuk in Eishes Chayil, that the house, her home, should not be afraid of snow. Kichol beisav lavushanim, because her entire home is dressed in warmth. So Losira beisa mishalig, shaleg or sheleg is Shin Lamed Gimel, which is the year that the Arizal was nifter. And what the pasuk means is, don't be afraid of the fact that in the year Shin Lamed Gimel, the Arizal passed away. Why? Ki cholvesav lavu shanim, because her entire home is dressed in warmth. Chazal say, don't read shanim ela shnayim. Don't read it as warmth, but rather read it as twice, as two, as a double. So lo sira mi beisa mishaleg. Don't be afraid of the year that the Arizal was nifter in Tuf Shin Lamed or Tuf Reish Lamed Gimel, or Tuf Kuf Lamed Gimel. My math is terrible, but in Shin Lamed Gimel, don't be afraid of the fact that the Arizal died early. Why? Because Ki Cholvesav Lavu Shnayim, there's going to be two more iterations of Pnimius HaTorah throughout the generations, which are the Baal Shem Tov and Rabbi Nachman. So even though the Arizal was not Zoichet to be Megala, the Soides HaYichud, and the secrets of unity, which would ultimately reveal the full grand total of Pnimius HaTorah, thereby heralding the redemption. Because we shouldn't be afraid, because we have the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh and we have Rabbi Nachman. And what the Rebbe points out, based on this year's Avodah of this Segel, which is again 2 dots on top and 1 dot on the bottom, is simply that our Avodah this year is to create a unity between these 3 Tzadikei Hadoros, to create a unity between the teachings of the Arizal, the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, and the teachings of Rabbi Nachman. The left dot on top of the Segel, which represents constriction and it represents limitation and it represents Bina, is the light of the Arizal. The Arizal's Torah discusses measurements, and it discusses tzimtzum, and it discusses constriction and limitations of what we're capable of understanding as human beings. The right dot of the Segel represents the Torah of the Baal Shem Tov, because part of the Torah of the Baal Shem Tov was learning through the Arizal, as well as another student of the Arizal, who was Rav Yisrael Sarug, who revealed worlds that were far beyond the teachings of Rav Chaim Vital and Eitz Chaim, something that's referred to as Oilamos de Ein Sof, the worlds of the infinite, and we're going to get to the practicality of this. And then the dot on the bottom that unifies the two is the Torah of Rabbi Nachman and the Baal HaTanya, as the Rebbe writes in Shalosh Shudas from Kisavo this year, which discusses the same idea, which is the Torah of being masig, that in every moment a person is both a finite self, containing within itself and connecting to the infinite of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is the revelation of Ani v'ayin b'vasachas, myself and nothingness at once, recognizing that up and down, above and below, dark and light are ultimately part of the same process. And the avodah of this year is to unify that segel, to take all 3 various parts that comprise that inverted triangle, and to reveal that all of them are ultimately revealing the same thing. Now, these sugyas are endless, but Baruch Hashem, I was able to speak to one of the Talmidim of the Tzaddik today, and he kind of clarified for me exactly what the Nakuda of this should be. The main point is recognizing that all ways of learning Torah, all ways of serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu, all ways of studying Pnimius HaTorah are ultimately part and parcel of the same thing. That all machlokes and all stira in the Torah, even though it looks like there's 3 various parts to it, 3 various separate points, in truth, it's a segula, it's the segel that allows us to see how all difference is ultimately part of a unity that is greater than the sum total of itself. And by connecting that which appears to be separate and revealing that it's part of the same process, what we do is we reveal the true unity and the true shape and color of what Pnimius HaTorah is coming to teach us. On the one hand, the Torah of the Arizal represents the darga of Mimale Kol Almin, of recognizing HaKadosh Baruch Hu down here in this world, realizing that I have a self, I have attachments, I have family, I have things I care about, I have things I feel, and that HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs everything. That's what we refer to as Yichud Tata, a lower level of unity where I still exist, my attachment still exists, my desire still exists, but my job is to recognize that in truth, all that exists is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's what's referred to as Bittul Hayesh. That's the darga of the Arizal's Torah. Then there's the darga of Chachma, which is the Torah of the Baal Shem Tov, which is that I really don't even exist so much anymore. All that exists is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is what's referred to as Soiviv Kol Almin, the transcendent presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or the Yichud Ilah, which is Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. There's B'derech Klal always a machlokas between these 2 ideas. The Arizal says that I am a self in a world, and my job is to nullify myself in the face of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence. The Baal Shem Tov says, there is no self and there is no world. All there is HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and my job is to nullify myself completely and to be mavata myself, b'tachlis habittel. The entirety of the Baal Shem Tov's Mahalach was avoida in bittel, while the Arizal's Mahalach is much more an avoida in how I deal with this world. And then the third dot underneath, which is the Torah of Atika Stima'ah, which is that concealed Torah that stands at the ready to be revealed, is the unity between those two polar opposites. It's the recognition that on the one hand, the world exists and there's separation and there's distortion and there's difficulty and there's concealment and there's all of the struggle and all of the different pratim. But at the very same moment, all of those pratim and all of those distinctions and all of those separations do not create any disunity at the heart of unity, but rather every moment of constriction serves as an opportunity to reveal an even greater measure of the infinite presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's light. This is what the Rebbe refers to as ani va'ayin bevasachas. That's the Torah of the yichud between the Torah of the Arizal and the Baal Shem Tov, that Rabbi Nachman comes along as well as the Baal Tanya on a certain level, not as far as Rabbi Nachman. And it was particularly when the Baal Tanya came out of prison afterwards, when it's Pada B'Shalom Nafshi. A remez for that could be that Tuf Shin Pei Beis is Tehei Shnas Pada B'Shalom, which is the sugi of Yud Tes Kislev, when the Baal Tanya came out of prison, singing Pada B'Shalom Nafshi. But either way we slice it, the avodah of our Torah, the Torah of Rabbi Nachman, is to be Megala, the yichud between ani va'ayin, to show how pratius and klalius, light and darkness, are not stiros to one another, but rather they serve to enlarge in and intensify and manifest an even deeper presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is what the Rebbe's Torah has always been about, that a person has to descend from unity into disunity for the sake of revealing that disunity is also part of unity, thereby revealing how large and powerful and infinite the unity of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is. By taking all of those separate points that make up those three stages of distortion and revealing that in truth they're part of the same segul, the part of the same segula. And this, the Rebbe says, is the avodah. It's an incredible thing. In Tufshin Pei Beis, when the world's on fire, when everything's spinning out of control, the Iker Eitzah that the Tzaddik is giving us to do this year is to begin to learn properly the words of the Arizal and to recognize that the only way to understand the sugyos of the Arizal is if we understand what the Baal Shem Tov was teaching us and if we understand what Rabbi Nachman is teaching us. Not to look at Pnimius HaTorah as some mathematical system that is devoid of a human element or an emotionality or a heart siddika type of approach, but rather to realize that the deepest depths of secrets are meant to be revealed specifically down here in our lived experiences. And when we begin to learn the Torah of the tzaddikim and realize that the tzaddikim were never b'machlokas, and that in truth each tzaddik is just mislabesh and shines through another tzaddik, we give ourselves a directive for the year to live a year of shalom between all of the different forms of Torah, and more importantly, adarcha avoda, to live that shalom in ourselves. We all live with this constriction. We all live, on the one hand, with a desire to live with just a klal, unity. On the other hand, we're very well aware of the fact that this world is predicated on disunity. And instead of saying that we have to get rid of disunity for the sake of unity, what the Rebbe is teaching us is that by dragging disunity into unity, what we're being megala is the deepest level of light imaginable. That's the Tosefes Kishut. And it's our job this year to draw that down. Whether or not it's the Geula itself is not, it's up to us and it's not up to us, but what's up to us is our ability to be Mekusher to Tzadikim Ha'amitim, to believe in the Torah of the Tzadikim Ha'amitim, and to be Makasher all of the Tzadikei Hadoros together, to realize that all of the disparity in our lives and in the universe and in the Torah itself is all there just so that we can go through the disunity and reveal the greatness of a unity that makes room for disunity within itself. It's all too easy to run towards a yichud or a unity that has no room for separation. The ikr nekuda, the tachlis hadira betachtoinim that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants. Where does Hashem want us to crown him king? Specifically in the mud, specifically down here. The Malachim could have done it very easily without any problem. But the greatness of the Hamlacha and saying Hamelech from within the muck of our lives, from within the difficulties, from within Uman, the edge of the universe, the lowest of the lowest imaginable places, as Menachem himself writes, and for those of us who are Zilcha also to be Makosher to Yerushalayim, to realize that Higia Hazman, that Yerushalayim is becoming clearer and clearer and lighter. Yerushalayim, that place of Shalom, that takes all disparity and disunity and reveals that it's really part of one greater whole. And that's the avodah of the Tzaddik's Torah. That's the avodah of learning the Arizal and the Baal Shem Tov and Rabbi Nachman. And this is what the Rebbe tells us. Baruch Hashem, he could have said that we have to fast and do hard things. It's not what we have to do. We get to learn the most beautiful Torah in the world. We get to learn it in a way that it's harder not to understand than it is to understand with the Svarim we have nowadays, with the Tzaddikim we have nowadays. And it's an easy avodah. We have to believe in the words of the Tzaddikim. We have to believe in ourselves that we're roi to learn the words of the Tzaddikim. And Be'ezras Hashem, it should be Zoicha. I just was thinking beforehand that Tafshin Pei Beis is Roshei Tevos Tehei Shnat Panim Bepanim. It should be a year of face-to-face revelation. Panim Bepanim means the Giloy in the deepest way of the Torah of the Arizal and the Baal Shem Tov and Rabbi Nachman, but it also means Bepashtas Kamashmo, to see things face to face, to see HaKadosh Baruch Hu face to face, not to be stuck in a back-to-back relationship, not to be stuck behind masks or in all forms of concealment, but rather to be Zoichet to Panim Bepanim. Be'ezras Hashem Yisbarach.